Hello and welcome to episode 95 of A Slice of Medieval. Today we are welcoming David Pilling, who is a writer and researcher, passionate about history, especially the medieval era, and growing up exploring Welsh castle ruins fueled his fascination. Actually, I was similar with Yorkshire's castle ruins. He also has a deep interest in the Byzantine Empire, post-Roman Britain, and the British and Irish Civil Wars. He writes historical fiction and non-fiction, including the non-fiction book Edward I and Wales, which is the exact topic he is here to chat with us about today. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
So, I suppose the first question is a little bit of a background into Wales. We always think of Wales as having princes, but didn't they once have kings, and what happened to them?
Yeah, that's a bit of a vexed question. Basically, yes, up until the end of the 12th century, the various rulers of Wales tended to use the title king, Brenin in Welsh, Rex in Latin. But then the title after about 1200 seems to fall out of use. The last Welsh ruler to explicitly use the title Brenin Rex is Dafydd ab Owain Gwynedd, one of the sons of Owain Gwynedd, who was ruler of Gwynedd in North Wales in the mid to late 12th century. Dafydd explicitly uses the title on his charters, Rex Norwali, King of North Wales, even though he wasn't really. He'd actually been kicked out and he was being forced to live in exile on the border, but he was still using the title. But after that, what you find is the Welsh rulers, they used the title which translates into Welsh as Tywysog, Tywysogion, plural, which in English does translate as prince. But I think prince gives us a slightly misleading impression because we tend to view a prince as a downgrade on a king, because a prince is usually the heir to a king. And the impression is in some quarters that what the English did, or the Anglo-Normans, or however you want to term them in this period, is that they forced the Welsh to adopt this kind of subsidiary title. So after about 1200, instead of being kings, they had to call themselves prince because they were ultimately vassals of the English crown and the marcher lords who were trying to take over Wales. But I don't think that's true, really, because the very first Welsh ruler to actually use the title Tywysog, prince, was Owain Gwynedd. And what it really means, it comes from the Latin princeps, and might even go all the way back to the days of the Augustus, first Roman emperor, because he never used the title emperor. He called himself princeps. And what it kind of means is first among equals, which he wasn't, obviously. He was very much, there are no equals to Augustus. He's imperator, he's the emperor. But he was clever enough not to actually use the title. And what Owain Gwynedd was doing, because he and his advisors were very, like most Welsh rulers, they were very aware of history, especially classical antiquity, is he was saying, I am the overlord of all the other rulers of Wales. This is what this title means. He called himself Princeps Walenses, which translates very awkwardly into English as Prince of the Waleses. It doesn't really make any sense as a literal translation. But it basically, how we should perceive the title is overlord. That's what it is. And when Henry II learned that Owain was using this title, he went berserk because he was trying to assert his overlordship of Wales. And Owain, by using this title, was actually setting himself up as a direct rival. And there's some very interesting letters in which Thomas Becket, of all people, him and Henry are still friends at this moment, was trying to cool things down. And his correspondence to Owain is quite interesting. He's basically saying, look, you might want to reconsider this. But Owain says, no, no, I don't care what Henry thinks. So if you move it forward to post 1200, I think basically what's happening is that any Welsh ruler that adopts this title, he's absolutely not saying I am subordinate to the English, because why would he do that? Voluntarily accept that I'm inferior to these people. He's basically
Mm.
trying to assert his supremacy. And so in the mid 12th century, for instance, the then ruler of Gwynedd, Dafydd ap Llywelyn, he is the first to explicitly use the title of Princeps Wali, which is Prince of Wales in English. And again, there's this impression that, oh, it's a kind of subsidiary title. Well, it isn't. It's basically a way of saying that I'm in charge of the whole of Welsh Wales and as much of the rest of it as I can grab. So it's an expression,
Mm.
it's different to a king. Now, why they stopped using the title king, that's difficult. I don't really know, but it's a political move. And
Mm.
I mean, others will disagree, but I really don't think it's the Welsh rulers basically voluntarily coughing up their sovereignty and saying, we're essentially inferior to the Saison, to the English.
Mm.
Mm.
That does actually make a lot more sense than, like you say, I think we do, of course, have a habit of looking at things through modern
Mm.
eyes, and we're thinking, king and then prince. But in medieval times, that wasn't even the process anyway, was it? Because princes weren't called prince.
Mm.
Edward the First was the
Yes,
Lord
that's right.
Edward when his dad was
Mm.
king. They
Mm.
didn't use the title prince in those times anyway. So we're
Yes,
actually attaching how we use that
yes.
title to the Welsh rather than how they used that title in those
When you're
days.
discussing this era of medieval Wales, there's so many sort of filters you have to clear aside because it's almost like this particular issue has been weaponized to an extent because it's an example of kind of English oppression and forcing the rulers of Wales to admit their inferiority. But if you look at who these people actually were, they're just about the last people on earth to admit their inferiority.
Mm,
They're all of the major ruling houses of Wales by this point, they've all got very long histories stretching back to the pre-conquest era in England. They all know very much who they are, and they have various competing claims to overlordship. And they don't, unless they're absolutely, somebody's got his foot on your neck. They don't admit inferiority because that's like a death sentence. You're not going to do that.
Mm.
I
mm,
mean, Welsh politics is pretty vicious in the dynastic sense. So yeah, I think we need to be careful with our interpretations. It's difficult to be 100% certain because it may be that within the different parts of Wales, the title meant something slightly different to individual rulers.
mm,
So,
Mm.
for instance, Rhys ap Griffith, who's remembered as the Lord Rhys, even though that's not the title he used, confusingly. He called himself Princeps Llywali and Princeps Wali. So he's Prince X, Overlord of South Wales and Overlord of Wales, but he used the titles at different times and different charters. And
mm,
what he's probably doing is he's sort of doing what was the pragmatic thing to do at the time. What am I trying to do in this specific instance? Why am I using this title? And you have to look at when these charters were issued and what was the political situation at
mm.
the time, rather than making broad statements. I mean, Reese is another one. He's just about the last person to admit that he's inferior to the Marcher Lords. I mean, he spent most of his life killing them.
Yeah, I think the term princes is more of a generic term in medieval times because they talk about lords and princes, and when they say princes, they don't mean sons of
No, not
kings.
necessarily.
They mean people,
Yeah,
rulers
Yeah.
of
I mean,
some
Machiavelli
description.
called his book The Prince.
Yeah,
And it's a general
Mm,
guidebook on how a prince should behave. What's a prince? He's basically meaning, I guess, someone of royal blood who's in charge of a nation or a power.
yeah,
mm,
yeah,
Yeah, we should be very careful with our definitions, and I think that the only way to have a reasonable understanding of why the title is used is to look at each context and go, well, what's going on here?
absolutely.
Why is this individual doing this?
Yeah. A title is essentially an expression of power, isn't it?
Mm,
So when it's used and how it's used and to whom it's
mm.
used is, as you say, the context is everything,
And
really.
we shouldn't underestimate how pragmatic these people were. I mean, some of the lords, on the border, say the lords of Powys, they were quite happy to flip their definitions and their titles depending on context. So Griffith at Gwenwyn Wyn, for
mm,
instance, At various times, he called himself a Prince of Wales, and then at other times he appeared in court and said, "I am a martial lord," um, depending on how he wanted to flip
Yeah.
it. And what he spent most of his life
Mm.
suing people. And he was more likely to win various cases if he said, "Oh, I'm a martial lord now," and that gives me a
Mm.
certain kind of like legal standing that I wouldn't do if I stood on my sort of identity as a Prince of Wales. But then in another context, it was more convenient to say I'm a Prince of Wales. I think if some of these people came back to life and we put some of these arguments to them, they'd probably just laugh and go, "Wow, not why are you stupid? Why do you think I'm doing this?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Get
get
over it.
over it. You know, the reality of power is just that. I mean, don't be naive."
Mm. Okay, so just before Edward the First comes to the throne, what's the situation in Wales? What's the politics of Wales at that point in so a little bit earlier in the 13th
Well, he
century?
comes to the throne technically in 1272. Doesn't
Yeah.
actually arrive until 1274. By that point, Llywelyn Griffith, also known as Llywelyn the Last, he had been formally acknowledged as Prince or Overlord of Wales by Edward's father, Henry III, which was his main sort of political achievement, really. And it shouldn't be underestimated because Llywelyn is the only Welsh ruler to have that title formally acknowledged by a King of England. So the Llywelyn was the ruler of Gwynedd, grandson of Llywelyn the Great. He had technically been acknowledged as the ruler of the whole of what is Pura Walia, Welsh Wales. So he's entitled to the homage of all the other rulers of Wales, with one exception, who is Maredydd ap Rhys, the ruler of Deheubarth in South Wales. They're very bitter rivals. But ironically, Maredydd is forced to swear homage to Llywelyn because he's sold by Edward's brother, Edmund. He's sold to Llywelyn and for something like 10,000 marks. And after that happens, Llywelyn is basically in charge of Welsh Wales. He's also got various alliances going with Marcher dynasties. So this is as close as Wales gets, really, to being ruled by a single sovereign Welsh ruler. There's still a lot of disturbance, especially on the border. Llywelyn is at war with several of the Marcher dynasties, and his authority, his effective authority, only lasts a few years. He's acknowledged as Prince of Wales in 1267. Edward goes on crusade in 1269. Edward himself, at this stage, is not interested in Wales. He makes that very clear. He actually says to his father a few years earlier that this is a waste of time. We've been pumping money, men, and resources into Wales for, well, generations and getting very little in return. According to Matthew Paris, he says, let's just give Wales back to the Welsh. Not because he wants to be nice to the Welsh, he just thinks it's a complete waste of time and resources. And they've got more than enough to do in England and Gascony and Ireland, and he wants to go on crusade. So, which is quite ironic considering what Edward ends up doing. Um,
Yeah, but I think it's like you say, it's a matter of money, isn't it? They're pouring resources into Wales. Edward wants to go on
yes, yeah.
crusade. So, it's like that's money I can use to go on
Yeah,
crusade.
and
Let's
he actually, I mentioned a few moments ago that Llywelyn was entitled to the homage of all the Lords of Wales except one who sold back to him. Well, some of that money was supposed to go towards funding the crusade. So that kind of, more than anything, reveals Edward's mindset. He's
Mm.
like,
Mm.
I'm not interested in Wales. I want to go to the Holy Land, and he's scratching about. It's very expensive, you know, to mount a crusade by this time. So that's his sort of motive. Llewellyn's big threat at this time is not Edward; it's Gilbert de Clare, who is the Earl of Gloucester and the Lord of Glamorgan in southeast Wales. And outside of the royal family, probably the most powerful man in England, Wales, maybe Ireland.
Mm.
Very powerful, very ambitious figure who played a very important role in the Civil War in England.
Mm.
Probably tilted the balance against Simon de Montfort. And he and Llywelyn are at loggerheads over what's happening in southeast Wales. Llywelyn wants to expand into southeast Wales, into Morgannwg, the old Welsh kingdom of Morgannwg, and basically expand his principality. What he wants to do ultimately, if he can, is take over the whole of Wales, if that's realistic. But it
Mm.
means pushing out the Marcher Lords, which is not easy. And he runs up against Gilbert de Clare in 1270. And Clare, by this point, has started work on his big castle of Caerphilly, which is obviously one of the big landmarks. It's still very much there.
Mm.
And there's this very messy war, which actually ends with Llywelyn's first real defeat. He's been very successful up to this point and been able to sort of carry his sort of people with him. But in Gilbert de Clare, he meets this sort of immovable object. You can't shift the Clares. They're too stuck into Southeast Wales. They're too powerful. And this war drifts into a stalemate, which is quite embarrassing for Llywelyn because his intention was to destroy Caerphilly, to stop Clare building this castle. Because as soon as this thing is built, I mean, you can see what a monster it is. You know, that's not going anywhere, and it would nail down the presence of the Clares in this part of Wales.
Mm.
And he manages to burn down the first structure, but then Clare ignores this truce and just starts building a new one. And Llywelyn can't destroy that. And he's eventually forced to evacuate completely and retreat all the way to Gwynedd in North Wales. And it's at this point, really, that things start to fracture for him. Some of the people in his household who are witnessing this, they start smelling blood and going, Llywelyn's vulnerable. We can get rid of him. Because his success and his survival depends entirely on maintaining his position. As long as he's winning and he's doing well and he's expanding his frontier, then that's fine. But there are a lot of dissidents in the Welsh court who are just waiting for him to start to fail. And two in particular, his brother Dafydd and Griffith ap Gwenwyn Wyn, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, Lord of Powys, who inherited a very old dynastic feud with Gwynedd, spent his youth in exile, and basically spent the whole of his career planning to destroy the House of Gwynedd. And Dafydd, who is this very controversial, disaffected figure, always lurking in the background, waiting for his sort of opportunity. I think it's this moment where Llywelyn suffers this bad defeat in Southeast Wales. Not in any, he doesn't like get defeated in a battle or anything like that, but he is forced to just withdraw and give up on this whole project. It's at this point that things start to fracture, and a lot of people who don't like him, Welsh people, they start to plan, to kill him. Basically, they're planning to murder him, and this is all nothing to do with Edward. He's not even in the country at this point.
Yeah. So why did Edward invade Wales then? Because, like you say, he goes on crusades, and 1272 his dad dies as he's on his way back from crusade. Then he takes this tour around his continental lands before he arrives in England in 1274. Yeah. By which point his coronation's already been delayed by a couple of months because he decided to have this big meeting was it in Gascony or somewhere, where he met loads of people and then decided, I'd better get back to England and get crowned at some point.
It was Limoges.
Limoges,
which is to the north of Gascony. Yeah, Edward's attitude at this point is interesting. He is just as much concerned by what's happening to his lands in France as England, which is it's quite difficult to understand because England is still in a pretty fragile state. There's this kind of impression, which when you look at the evidence, I think is quite misleading, that England was kind of okay, that it had got over the Civil War, and it hadn't really. There was still a lot of violence, a lot of disturbances. The nobles were at each other's throats, and Edward was perfectly aware of this because he's informed of it as he's coming back through Italy by Burgundy. That's eastern France, isn't it? He's well aware of events, but then he hears of this trouble in Gascony. There's a revolt there, and he chooses to go there to deal with that rather than go back to England. And then he learns of this trouble in Limousin, in Limoges, which is to the north, and he decides to go and get involved in that. So he's not particularly fussed about rushing back to England. And then he finally gets there, and he's got a lot of things to sort out in England. And there's no rush to war with Wales. It's very easy to skate over these years and sort of give this impression that Edward is practically chomping at the bit to get stuck into Wales. He's not at all. What's happened is that when Llywelyn was acknowledged as Prince of Wales, there was a sting in the tail. He had to swear homage and fealty to the King of England, which was Edward's father at the time. And that deal was permanent. It meant that he and his heirs had to agree to swear homage to whoever, like to the kings of England in perpetuity forever, and to pay a mortgage for his title of 25,000 marks, which is about the equivalent of £20,000 in English money, which wasn't a huge amount by English standards, but by the standards of Llywelyn's principality, it was a lot of money. I mean, the annual customs revenue of Gwynedd at this point was £17. in England, it was 10,000. So that gives
Yeah.
you an idea of the kind of money we're talking about. And Llywelyn's big problem is basically this agreement that he's sort of saddled himself with. In order to achieve virtual sovereignty over Wales, he's given up a great deal in exchange. He can't meet the terms of the financial agreements. That's clear from the financial records that have existed. He had to strain every single resource to try and find the money because there isn't really a monetary based economy in Wales at this time. Currency is circulating, but there's no mint. Gwynedd didn't have a
Mm.
mint, so they weren't minting their own coinage. And he tries to break with Welsh law and custom and introduce financial penalties instead of the renders, which the Welsh were used to. That's very unpopular. And so his position is becoming increasingly fragile. And then Edward comes home. And what Edward wants is for Llywelyn to come to London or even meet him on the border and swear homage and fealty, which is what he's required to do via the terms of the treaty. And Llywelyn
Mm.
had already refused to do this in Edward's absence. And he actually refuses 5 more summonses. And at one point, Edward actually goes to Chester and says, "Look, you can meet me at Chester. We'll do it there." And Llywelyn says, "No, I don't want to come to Chester. You come into Wales and we'll do it here." And there's this moment which is quite farcical where for about 2 weeks, they're about 10 miles apart. Llywelyn won't cross the border into England and Edward won't cross the border into Wales because that would be giving up. You'd be losing face if you did that.
Yeah.
And neither of these men
Mm.
can afford to do that. It's not just an ego thing, it's a political thing. It's very important for
Mm.
their status. I mean, Llywelyn is on increasingly shaky ground. Edward has inherited a very sort of fragile kingdom, and they've got to maintain this kind of solid front. And this aborted meeting at Chester is 1275, I think. And that, I think, is the last realistic chance from Edward's point of view that this is going to happen. He issues more summons after that, but I don't think he was only doing that to give the impression that Llywelyn was being disobedient, to add to his portfolio of grievances of why I'm eventually going to take military action.
Hasn't he also got when did he take Helena de Montfort into
Yeah, well,
custody?
there's this whole controversy over the continued involvement of the Montfort clan. Basically, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that Llywelyn was in contact with Simon's sons, Simon Jr. and Guy, who were in France and Italy by this point, and their mother, Countess Eleanor, who's living at the convent of Montargis in France. And Eleanor is a fascinating figure. She's a bit shadowy, as a lot of these women tend to be. You know, the
Mm.
men are in the
Tell me
forefront
about
and
it.
then the women are in the shadows. But it's
Yep.
Eleanor really who brokers the marriage alliance in which she arranges for her daughter, another Eleanor, to go to Wales and marry Llywelyn. And there's clearly this political alliance. And there's also evidence that one of Eleanor's officers, her proctor, a man named Nicholas of Waltham from Lincolnshire, that he was being used as the messenger. He was the go-between. He was carrying messages from Montargis to Llywelyn in Wales and back again. And according to later charges laid against him, he was also acting as a spy in Edward's court because he's very well placed. He's a sort of a lawyer, so he can do
Mm.
all these things. And he was carrying information back to France and then to North Wales. He's a very busy boy. So, and then Edwards, he's kind of increasingly suspicious, and he's got his own agents in Paris who are watching these people. It's all sort of fascinating stuff. I think it's like sort of 13th century John le Carré spy thriller stuff. You know, basically
Yeah.
what's happening is that the one thing Edward is not going to permit is for the Montforts to have any kind of influence ever again in England. So when Eleanor Jr. and her brother Amory, they try to get into to sail to Wales to seal the marriage alliance, Edward has got ships looking out for them, and they intercept them in the Bristol Channel. And according to a letter Edward sent to the Pope, his sailors levered up the boards, and they found this banner underneath, this Montfort banner that was wrapped around a cache of weapons. which I think is overdoing it a bit. You don't need that. It was sufficient that they were trying to get to Wales. Some bright spark in the Chancery went, oh, why don't we add this detail about he had some
Yeah.
bombs aboard or something.
Yeah.
Um,
Just make sure that he accepts that there's rebellion
yeah,
afoot.
yeah. Just because the Pope, just to sort of really convince the Pope that there's something sinister afoot. So there's this kind of, there's this situation of deteriorating relations. What I don't really understand from Llewellyn's perspective is why he didn't go through with the ceremony of swearing homage, because
Mm,
however distasteful he found it, and whatever his sort of reasons, I mean, he claimed that he wasn't obligated to do that until the king could guarantee that he wouldn't be attacked by the Marcher Lords and that sort of thing. Well, I mean, Edward wasn't one to be dictated to, and also he couldn't have given that guarantee anyway.
mm.
He could have said to Gilbert the Clare,
Mm.
"Don't attack Llewellyn," but he would have done it anyway. Um, you
Yeah,
know,
that's true.
Yeah, the Marcher Lords were fairly
Yeah,
indifferent.
exactly. That was their whole thing, wasn't it? But if Llewellyn had gone through with it, that would have really undercut any kind of reason Edward could have given for going to war, because Llewellyn had done what
Mm.
was required of him. And
Mm,
I mean, the Pope was a huge factor in this. They both were sending envoys to Rome all the time to justify their position, explain what they were doing, because he needed papal approval. But everything Llewellyn is doing, although he does his best to make a case, is not convincing the Pope at all. And I mean, and Edward is already in the
Mm.
Pope's good books because he's an ex-Crusader.
yeah.
He's kind of been,
Yeah.
he's done what Rome wanted him to do. And Edward's got quite a good relationship with the Pope at this time. The trouble of these popes is they don't last very long. Sort of 2 or 3 years,
No.
then you get a new one.
Yep.
But yeah, I think Llewellyn's actions in not, I think the mistake he makes, whatever his sort of justification, is that, I mean, he entered into this agreement with Edward's father, and it was his idea. He wasn't forced into it. And you could argue that the devil is really in the original treaty. It's like, why would you give up, sovereignty permanently? Also, you can be called prince. Is it really
Mm,
that important? But that's what he does, and he's kind of saddled with this agreement, and it can always be used as a stick to beat him with. It's like, well,
mm.
this was your idea, mate. So in a nutshell what's going on up until about sort of mid 1270s, 1275.
And is there any particular trigger for the invasion of Wales, or is it just Edward decides, well, I've prepared the
Hmm.
ground politically, I need to sort of sort this
Well,
problem
again, when
out?
you look at how it actually happens, Edward technically he formally declares war in November 1276 after Llewellyn has refused 6 summonses to come and do homage. But although there's some scattered fighting, then there's another pause when the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is Robert Kilwardby, he persuades Edward to kind of hesitate while he tries another round of negotiations, and these letters go back and forth. And the sort of the war proper doesn't really start until February 1277. And by this point, you have to say Llewellyn is not cutting a very impressive figure, because he starts sending these letters to Edward, which when you read them, they're kind of like begging letters. Before, he'd kind of been quite defiant and said, I'm not paying any more money until my objectives are met, my demands are satisfied. And then he starts going, I've got the money, here's the money. Don't listen to these guys at court who are speaking out against me. Oh, and you remember that money I didn't give you 10 years ago? I've got that money as well. At which point, which hands Edward a weapon, he goes, oh, so you have got the money. Right. Okay. So that was a lie then, was it? And I think what's happened is that Llewellyn has realized that the threat of force has suddenly become very real, and that he's probably come to realize that his own position in Wales is not as strong as he thought it was.
Mm,
And he can't rely on the
Mm.
loyalty of a lot of people in Wales who mattered, especially Welshmen on the march near the sort of the border areas between Welsh Wales and the areas controlled by the Marcher Lords, because the loyalties are so sort of mixed by this point. But also within Gwynedd, I mean, he's had a lot of trouble with his family, his close family, his brothers. And then he starts being undermined by nobles, people within his household who start deserting him and running off to join Edward's army. And as the war develops into a full-blown conflict, it becomes quickly very obvious that Llewellyn's power base is very fragile indeed. And within 6 or 7 months, everything has kind of collapsed. It all falls away under him. And there's quite a lot of material evidence for what happens, and it's interesting to see the number of men who jump ship and who then appear on various wage rolls or rolls of gifts. I mean, taking money from Edward, and one of them is Llywelyn's own court bard, a man named Griffith Aberynad Coch, who would later end up writing one of the magnificent elegies or marwnads for Llywelyn, which is very famous. It's one of the greatest poems of written medieval Europe. But at this stage, he's done a bunk, he's deserted, and he takes a very high payment of £20 from the king for some unspecified service. I'm still not sure what that's all about. And by November 1277, Llywelyn's forced to just throw the towel in and surrender to Edward, and he submits at Aberconwy in North Wales and agrees to this treaty, which pretty much wipes out everything he's achieved in the past 20 years. He's left with his title and this kind of fragment of authority. But I mean, I would argue if you're talking in terms of Welsh sovereignty and semi-independence from England or the English crown, this is probably the most important conflict in Welsh history. Everything after that is kind of an effort to get it back, even down to you look at someone like Owain Glyndŵr, it's like a rebellion to try and get back what is lost. Well, it's lost at this moment, and the treaty is quite extreme. Although Edward waives some of the more harsh penalties, because that's a sort of a calculated way of seeming merciful, is you impose a fine of £50,000, which he's never going to be able to pay, and then you waive it and go, oh no, I don't want that. It's quite a good trick. But the reality of the situation is that Llywelyn is left as Prince of Wales, and he's left in place west of the River Conwy in North Wales. So basically, he's got his sort of mountain heartland, what is now Snowdonia and Anglesey, but he's very, very restricted. And this is what Edward wants. He's like, well, I've not killed him, I've not destroyed him, and I've done nothing illegal. Well, he hadn't really. And Llywelyn's still got his title, and I'll allow him to marry Eleanor de Montfort, because that's what happens next. He says, okay, fine, you can actually, if that's it, you really want to marry her, that's fine. I'm going to be present at the wedding and I'll give you away because I'm in charge, I'm in control, and this happens at Worcester. And that, as far as Edward is concerned, is that's kind of, the situation is contained. Obviously, it isn't, but that's the situation as it appears in 1277.
You mentioned a couple of other prominent Welshmen, including his brother and so on. But are there people who want to oppose Edward more rigorously at that point, or do they accept what Llywelyn is
Funnily
doing?
enough, it's far easier to identify men who were only ever sort of grudgingly following Llywelyn because he was in the days of his success, and who then immediately turn on him the moment things go wrong. There's this failed assassination attempt in 1274, which is before Edward really gets involved, in which there's this sort of Macbeth-style attempt to kill Llywelyn. And it only fails because of a snowstorm, and the assassins can't actually get to where he was staying. But the intention was to kill him in his bedchamber, like Duncan. You can pick out men who are kind of loyal to Llywelyn until the end. A couple of the princes of northern powers of Adog. But what is startling is the sheer number of men who are willing to turn on him, and it implies, I think, that outside of Gwynedd and to an extent within it, they didn't really want to be sort of under a single unifying sovereign leader. And it's kind of, again, it's like a modern, I guess you could call it nationalism. This modern impression that that's what everyone wants. Naturally, you would want to have your own monarch or your own sort of head of state under a single nation, because that's pretty much what we do. That's, that post 1800, that's kind of the ideal. And those ideals get back projected onto the medieval period. And we can only obviously judge these people by their actions. In broad terms, Llywelyn does very well so long as he's winning the battles and he's winning the war. But I don't think he ever really wins the sort of ideological arguments. The other dynasties of Wales don't really want to be dominated by Gwynedd, because they say, well, why should we? The only reason we're doing it is because you're the strongest, the chief sort of warlord. But as soon as we get an opportunity, we're going to do our best to unravel this.
in medieval times, and I mean earlier, there's a big identification with your local area, your
Mm,
smaller local area,
mm.
rather than some sort of nation state. I mean, that's pretty common across Europe,
Yeah, I agree.
really.
And I think what's happening in Wales, and I think this is sort of fundamental, is every individual lordship or kingdom in Wales had its own identity and its own dynasty. And some of them had their own systems of laws, which are separate. For instance, Powys had its own sort of very complex legal system, the laws and customs of Powys, which were totally different from the laws of Gwynedd, the laws of Ceredigion or Deheubarth. And what would happen before this period that we're talking about is if King of England, usually, or the Marcher Lords would launch an invasion, the various Welsh lords would unite to see off that threat. This happens
Mm.
in, say, 1165, when most of the Welsh lords unite under Owain Gwynedd to see off Henry II, because he's launched this massive invasion. They don't want Henry II any more than they want to bow to anyone else. So they unite to see off this current threat. But as soon as that threat's dealt with, they go their separate ways.
Mm.
And in that
Mm.
way, they maintain their local independence. And I think that's how Wales works. And that's why it's so difficult to conquer, as opposed to, say, England, because England was united under one king. Effectively, the Normans just had to knock out Harold. Okay, it wasn't as easy as that, but that's basically what they had to do. They went into Wales and found they had dozens of kings and sub-kings to deal with, and you might conquer one bit of Wales only to find there's lots more guys to deal with, and it's very difficult. The topography is very difficult. It's a martial society. It's a very difficult place to even though it's relatively small, to conquer militarily. And ironically, what happens in this period is someone like Llywelyn comes along, effectively does unite Welsh Wales, only to find that no one really likes him. And now he's created a situation in which if he gets killed, the King of England can conquer Wales.
Mm.
Mm.
That's that, which is a quite sort of cold interpretation, but I think it is what happened.
So is it something like also that we see Wales as Wales,
Hmm.
one country
Hmm.
with a number of different rulers, and the Welsh actually saw Wales as an umbrella term, but it doesn't differentiate between the rulers. And as far as they're concerned, I rule Gwynedd, one rules Powys, and it's like you're looking at it as one country when it's a number of
I
little
think you can.
countries.
There's room for. It doesn't have to be either or. I mean, the medieval Welsh are obviously very aware that they're Welsh, and they have a shared language and an identity in that sense, and they have certain shared traditions, like Arthur, for instance. Most Welsh
Mm,
heroic poetry of this era, Arthur pops up all the time. He's the point of comparison that every Welsh ruler wants to be compared favorably to Arthur. So he's the man. So they have this sort of cultural things in common. But it doesn't mean that the ruler of Powys wants to be the vassal of the ruler of Gwynedd, because he doesn't. He's like, I'm just as important as him.
mm.
I know where Wales is. I know what Wales is. If you were to ask me to draw Wales on a map, I'm not an idiot. There it is. This is where we are. But it doesn't mean that they want to be united under a single ruler, because unless I'm the man, I could be
Yeah.
that guy. Um, yeah, again, it's a bit like discussing what we were discussing earlier, the meaning of various titles in Wales. We have to be very careful. It'd be all too easy to say that Edward I played upon this kind of divide and rule tactic in Wales, and the silly old Welsh, they were so disunited, they just let it happen. He rolled over them. Well, Wales have been politically disunited for centuries, and the
Mm,
Normans and the English, whatever you want to call them, they'd never really conquered the place. The
mm,
situation that's created by the rulers of Gwynedd from Llywelyn the Great onwards, and there's a historian, current historian, David Stevenson, who I think is the best current historian of medieval Wales. He makes this brilliant argument that what the rulers of Gwynedd did when they started expanding their power into Wales and centralizing it, they had to create an administration, because it's all very well to talk of conquest and glory and so forth, but in practical terms, if you're going to govern somewhere, you need a working administration. So they do that, and they set up this administration and they staff it with officers and clerks who they pick out from Gwynedd, who are not nobles, they're not aristocrats, they're drawn from this sort of mid-ranking part of Welsh society. And they start corresponding with the court in England. And these figures in the Welsh administration are very familiar figures at Westminster and Windsor because they have to, do all this diplomacy, and you can't ignore the King of England. And what that means is that the administrations start drawing closer together over the course of the century. And by the time you get to the Edwardian conquest, almost every single member of that Welsh administration joins Edward's army. They abandon Llywelyn, they dump him, and in some cases they're actually commanding Edward's troops. There's a man named Hywel ap Meirig, who is one of Edward's most prominent Welsh officers, and he actually leads an all-Welsh army drawn from Powys and Radnor and Builth Wells, and they invade Gwynedd in 1277 to really polish off what's left of Llywelyn's forces. And these people remain in place post-conquest. They remain in the administration. They're still there by the time of Edward II. Many of them fight in France, Edward III. And it's only when you get to 1400 that some of them join Glyndŵr. And that's a very interesting break, because these people had served the Plantagen's regime for over 100 years. And then suddenly they turn upon the King of England and join Owain Glyndŵr. But in this era, if you put aside, I think we need to put aside this whole kind of concept of England v Wales in an ethnic sense, because if you look at Edward's armies, over 2/3 are made up of Welshmen. A lot of people won't like that. I know they don't like it. They tell me so. But it's too bad, to say otherwise.
It's what it is.
Yeah, it would be like to sort of say otherwise would be like me arguing that the Battle of Hastings was an underrated English triumph. I mean, they just suck it up. It's sometimes, bad things happen. It's just the reality.
Presumably, it's a reflection also of the fact that areas other than Gwynedd are quite happy to attack Gwynedd.
Yeah.
Join Edward because, we're only fighting Gwynedd. So that's okay.
Because, all kinds of reasons. There's three major royal houses in Wales: Gwynedd, Powys, and Dynevor. And Llywelyn is the head of the House of Gwynedd, as well as Prince of Wales. But the heads of the other two, they've inherited very long-running dynastic feuds with Gwynedd. These dynastic conflicts, they stretch back to at least the 9th century, perhaps before. And they're all very aware of their history. So for that reason, they're opposed to Gwynedd, and there's a long history of warfare and conflict. I mean, I've mentioned Owain Gwynedd, who defeated Henry II, but Owain is seen as another sort of very patriotic figure. But if you look at what he did, he repeatedly invaded Powys and kingdoms in the south, Ceredigion in West Wales as well. He must have killed many more Welshmen than he did English people. It's all faction conflict, sort of, there's something you might recognize from the Wars of the Roses. These are rival houses. And at this point, as far as a lot of disaffected Welshmen are concerned, Edward, the power of the crown, King Edward, is a means to an end. It's like, we can use this to destroy Llywelyn, because apart from the dynastic feud angle, Llywelyn was a pretty oppressive ruler. As I said, he strained every available resource to meet the terms of this financial treaty. He broke with Welsh law and custom, which is something the Welsh really didn't like, because they were very sort of they prized tradition above everything. That's all important in Wales, ancestry and tradition. And Llywelyn, he just sort of breaks with all of this in order to impose monetary penalties, which is something else the Welsh don't like, because they're not used to handling money, and they're certainly not used to being sort of taxed like 6 times the going rate. So there's all kinds of things in flux. And then Llywelyn has problems with controlling his household and controlling his family. If you look at his relations with his siblings, he's got 4 siblings. He had a sister who is usually ignored, Mared, Owain Goch, Rodri, Dafydd, and Mared, and his relations with all 3 are equally fractious. They all seem to hate him. Mared, particularly, is bitterly opposed to Llywelyn, and they have these terrible stand-up rows in court. Now, I'd love to know more about, why this was the case, because we don't really know anything about what Llywelyn looked like, what he sounded like. anything about those sort of personal details. But he is, what is the common factor in all of these arguments? Well, it's him,
Mm.
and I suspect that in some way he must have been a difficult man to get along with, because you can't just blame everybody else. Oh, it's Barrett's fault.
Mm.
I mean, what he tries to do with his sister is really quite unpleasant. Her husband dies, and then her brothers-in-law try to steal her land and take custody of her young children. And Llywelyn throws his support behind them instead of his sister. And when she defends herself in court, he says, hand over those papers, those documents you're holding, because she stands to her own defense. And she refuses and says, no, I won't. And they're actually screaming at each other in court. And if anything is making Llywelyn look like an ineffective ruler, because his entire household is present and they're all watching this play out. I mean, this is not particularly impressive. You're yelling at your sister and she won't obey. It's not great.
Yeah, and also you're not protecting or standing
No.
behind your sister. You're actually helping to try and destroy
Yeah,
her.
which I guess made sense because her brothers-in-law were quite sort of powerful people, and it made sense you didn't want to alienate them. But I mean, she is your sister, and they are your
Mm.
nephews, and you're just trying to throw them under the bus.
There was this law in Wales, wasn't there? The law of inheritance was that you split when your father died. All the lands were split
Yeah.
between all the sons, I take it, rather than
Yeah,
all the children.
yeah, it's called gavelkind, I think.
Mm.
Partible inheritance.
Yeah.
This had really sort of bedeviled, any sort of attempt at unity, I suppose, especially in the preceding century, in the 12th century, because that's when things were really vicious. And if you read the Welsh Chronicles, there's these endless, horrific tales, really, of brothers and cousins murdering each other. Or rather, they didn't murder each other; they mutilated each other.
Yeah.
That
Blinded.
Yeah, and that there was this custom in Wales that if a ruler was blinded, sometimes castrated as well, but usually
Mm.
blinded, you had to be physically whole to be fit to rule. And so, if you were blinded, then you were then packed off to a monastery, and your brother or your son or whoever had done this to you would then take over. And what's interesting is that they had exact same custom in the Byzantine Empire,
Mm.
which seems, as far as I know, there wasn't much in the way of contact, but it's a strange coincidence. But one of the more enlightened things that actually the rulers of Gwynedd do from about 1200 onwards is they phase that out. You don't get that custom of ritual mutilation much after about 1200. What Llewellyn the Great does is he tries to do away with partible inheritance as well, because he wanted his second son, Dafydd, to inherit Gwynedd and be the sole ruler of Gwynedd, which meant he had to disinherit his eldest son by his first wife, who is Llewellyn's
Mm.
father. And you can see what Llewellyn the Great was trying to do. He could see that partible inheritance was damaging, and the English would only exploit it. And also, the custom of sort of blinding and castrating one's male relatives wasn't particularly enlightened or merciful way to behave. But this doesn't go down well with the Welsh because they're a very sort of tradition orientated society. And these problems that Llewellyn ap Griffith experiences against Edward, they're really seeded in the previous generation. And if you wanted to be harsh, you could go back to Llewellyn the Great and say, well, you shouldn't have tried to fiddle with these customs because however unpleasant they were actually working in the sense of preserving, a sense of Welsh independence. The English by this point weren't really making any headway in Wales. This is late 12th, early 13th century, the time of King John, early Henry III. And once you start sort of tampering and you start adopting what you could say English style customs, well, they understand that. They know what you're doing now. And they can, they can handle that. So the nature of Welsh society changes in some ways, more kind of, less bloody, more in line with what's going on in the rest of Europe. The weakness of that is that Kings of England, and you get to Edward I, they know exactly how to deal with that. That's the system they're brought up in as well.
Mm.
So you said a little bit earlier that So Edward thought everything was sort of settled and done and dusted, job done, and goes away. So why wasn't it settled then? What
Right.
happened then?
Well, I mean, so far I've probably given the impression or kind of emphasized Llywelyn's mistakes and his weaknesses. Post 1277, it's different. Edward's mistake, he makes the same mistake in Scotland later, is that he's won this overwhelming military victory, which may have instilled a false sense of confidence, because he turns his attention, personally, he turns his attention elsewhere. He thinks Wales is done and dusted. But his administration is very oppressive and staffed by men who are not particularly sensitive towards the Welsh communities they've been put in charge of. There's also Welshmen in his administration who are equally insensitive. Um, Basically, they are every bit as money sort of orientated as Llywelyn's administration and as extracting as much cash as possible while riding roughshod over any kind of Welsh traditional law and custom. And it's the people, when you look at the details of what's going on in local administration, it's as ever, it's the people at the bottom who suffer. The same people who had suffered under Llywelyn's financial exactions now have the exact same experience under Edward's administration. I guess the difference being that most of Edward's officers were English, and certainly at the top level, and they were perceived as foreign conquistadors. Not only are we being taxed to the hills, but we're being knocked about by arrogant foreigners. There's one man in particular, Reynold the Grey, the Justiciar of Chester, who's a very capable military man, and he's put in charge of the communities of Ross and Ruffyniog, which is the area of Wales west of Chester and bounded by the River Conwy. And there's a great long list of protests which survive in print by the Welshry of those communities against the things Reynold was doing to them. And if half of these protests are true, then he was being very nasty indeed. And one of the things he does, allegedly, was that he threatened to behead any Welshman who went to London telling tales to the king of all the kind of unpleasant exactions and oppressions that Reynold was inflicting on them. So there may have been an element of Edward's own officers sort of covering up what they were doing and hiding it from Edward, who seems at this stage, we sort of past 1277 now into about 1280, he's kind of blissfully unaware. He doesn't seem to really sort of take an interest anymore. And he just kind of assumes I'm embroiled in France now. I've got things to deal with in England and Gascony and also Ireland. Wales is fine. There's always trouble in Wales at some level. It'll be fine. And what he doesn't realise is that actually things are building up to a real sort of head of steam. And Llywelyn who's been left in place, he's slowly rebuilding his position. And there's some interesting charters dating from this time in which he's receiving men at his court, which is a very small court by this time. It's like a single room, probably. But he's receiving the homage of men who had actually fought against him in the previous war. So they're obviously not happy with the post-war settlement. And Llywelyn is kind of unveiling them. He's sort of seducing them back to his side. And one of them, importantly, is Dafydd, his permanently disgruntled brother, who had very much fought for Edward in the previous war and also tried to murder Llywelyn in 1274. But, that's all right. Family, eh? That's all sort of conveniently forgotten. Dafydd is unhappy for all kinds of reasons. Dafydd's never happy. It's very difficult to know what would have made Dafydd happy because both Llywelyn and Edward, they go to considerable lengths to placate him. Edward grants him lands in England. He grants him a marriage to a rich heiress, Elizabeth Ferrers. He's also given money to build a castle in Hopedale on the border, which is the last castle ever built by a Welsh prince. So, he's quite comfortable, but it's not enough. And I think what Dafydd wants ultimately is that he wanted to be Prince of Wales. And that's his sort of problem, really, is that he always thought that he was being denied his kind of birthright.
The middle child syndrome by any chance?
Yeah, I think so. I think so because the youngest brother, Rodri, he's not fussed at all. He sells out
Mm,
his inheritance to Llewellyn and goes and lives in England on a
mm,
night. He marries an English woman, and has a nice manor in, I think it's Sussex. And
mm,
he actually stops referring to himself by the Welsh form of his name. He calls himself Roderick. After
mm.
1280, he's
Mm.
Sir Roderick. I'm not interested. Um,
Nothing to do with me.
yeah, exactly. You could
Leave them
argue
to
he's
it.
the sort of the wisest of the lot. He's like, oh my
Yeah.
God, I'm getting as far away from this as I can. Um, but so yeah, David has got lots of resentments. I mean, you could go and pick over them in detail. He thought he was entitled to part of the inheritance of Gwenllian de Lacy, who's an interesting name, obviously of the Lacy family, who are Earls of
Mm,
Lincoln, but she's got a Welsh first name, Gwenllian, Anglo-Welsh noblewoman. She dies in about 1280, and David thinks he's entitled to part of her inheritance. I never managed to trace exactly what his claim was, but Edward kind of ignores it and gives the inheritance to someone else, and David doesn't like that. He also claims that some of his English neighbours are stealing his firewood. Um, that they're coming onto his land, chopping down his trees, and taking it back to their land. I mean, this is the sort of thing when you really get into it, and you look at the Welsh assize rolls and what the various rulers are accusing each other of. What is really making them angry here? We talk a lot about, nations and sovereignty. What's really annoying these people is that guy's nicking my firewood. And I'm entitled to £5 of that £25 inheritance, and I haven't got it. I'm going to
yeah.
pursue this through the courts for 30 years. And this is what really drives them. It's land and money. And I mean,
Mm,
David may well
Mm.
have looked at Edward's administration after 1277 and realized, oh my God, this is not what I intended. I may have wanted to cut Llewellyn down to size, but I didn't mean to sort of bring about this kind of avalanche of foreign influence. Um,
yeah. I wanted him to put me in charge,
yeah, exactly. This isn't
not an Englishman.
this is yeah. What's this nonsense? But it's very difficult to know because again, with David, I really wish some of these people had left a journal so
Yeah,
you can have
David
some
would be a very
idea
interesting one.
of what they were thinking. Well, anyway, you get to 1282. Edward has taken his eye off the ball, really. I don't think he was consciously oppressing the Welsh. What he was doing, he was engaged with lots of things elsewhere, and he was allowing his administration to do pretty much as it liked, which
Mm,
wasn't a good idea, as it turned out. Um, and then this revolt explodes, the Palm Sunday revolt in Easter 1282, which is actually led by David, of all people. Llewellyn joins eventually, but he's not. He doesn't join at the outset.
mm,
He has to sort of think about it for a while. And you could argue that David is actually the leading light of this rebellion, which quickly spreads. It's obviously quite well organised and had been sort of planned for a couple of years. Quickly spreads across most of Wales. And a lot of the men, the Welshmen who'd fought for Edward in the previous war, they now throw in their lot with Llewellyn and David, which is interesting. And Edward has suddenly, completely unexpectedly, because this, as far as he's concerned, this comes out of nowhere, he's suddenly got this very serious revolt on his hands. So we're into another war of 1282, which is a much nastier war than the previous one. Edward has to throw all of his resources at it. And this time he's very, very angry because he thought the whole thing was settled. And yeah, he's set on, okay, I've had enough now. Had
mm,
enough of Wales. I'm set on a final solution here. And what he ends up doing after 18 months of a very, very difficult, grinding, expensive war is he basically rips out the House of Gwynedd. When he's driven to it, Edward will happily adopt the most extreme policy. He does this at other times in his career.
Mm.
And he just flattens the House of Gwynedd, rips them out. Llewellyn is killed. David is tracked down and executed. First nobleman in the British Isles to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Not for
mm,
high treason, which is another misunderstanding. High treason didn't exist. It's not on the statute book by this point. David is executed for a number of offences, and each offence had its own penalty. I think there's 5 in total. And it's the same with William Wallace. some years later. They're cumulative offences. And
Mm.
the idea was, and it's not necessarily Edward's idea, but it's one he picks up on, is that mere hanging is not good enough for somebody who is offended to this degree. What you have to do is exterminate them physically and spiritually, because David had been excommunicated. Edward has still got the Pope on his side. So by the end, when the execution is over and David has been ripped to pieces, there is literally nothing left of him. He has no soul. He's gone, which in medieval terms is just about the most extreme thing you can do to anyone.
I know this might sound like an odd question, but did Edward the First win or did Wales lose?
It's an interesting one. Did he win or did Wales lose? I mean, I argue that we should probably push forward the date of Edward's actual conquest of Wales to 1295, because we're up to 1282. And that's seen generally as the kind of crux date, because Llywelyn and Dafydd are killed. And afterwards, Edward starts really building these massive castles and bringing in colonists. But then there's this major revolt in 1294, and Edward has to deal with that and spend another sort of year of very expensive campaigning in Wales. But from 1295, it's very difficult to argue that he doesn't have total control of Wales, because he can exploit every single resource after that date, particularly Welsh manpower. Edward I deploys staggering numbers of Welsh troops in Scotland and Flanders and Gascony, well in excess of anything his predecessors had managed. And that, I think, really shows that, okay, he's in charge now. So, I mean, you could probably get rid of a lot of the more kind of blustery language about Edward I. I mean, I don't like his title of Hammer of the Scots, because it gives the wrong impression. It kind of implies that he kind of effortlessly smashed the Scots. And in fact, it was a very difficult war, and ultimately couldn't really say he won in the end. But in Wales, I mean, really, whatever you think of Edward, the situation ends with probably the most complete military and political territorial settlement seen in medieval Europe. So, yeah, you'd have to argue that, yeah, he won. I mean, there are all kinds of factors in play, and it's absolutely not as simple as Edward marches in his big army and he wins. But he's thoroughly successful.
And that's the end of Llywelyn's family.
Not the end of them. I mean, 1282 marks the point where, I mean, that's the end of their power. The revolt in 1294 was used to be thought that it was led by one man, a chap called Madog ap Llywelyn, who was Llywelyn's cousin. And he briefly revived the House of Gwynedd in North Wales. And it used to be thought that he led this revolt, but actually more recent scholarship has shown that it was led by 5 different men across Wales. So it's more like a series of revolts than a single revolt. Madog lasted long enough to issue a single charter, which I've seen in the National Archives. It's like that big, tiny. And if you focus on it, you have to struggle to make out the detail. But he calls himself Prince of Wales and Lord of Snowdon. So for the space of about 3 months, he manages to revive the House of Gwynedd, and then Edward comes in and sweeps it all away again. Madog is not killed, actually, when he's finally captured. Him and his sons, they're treated very differently, because by this point, Edward has realised that you can't just kill everyone. So Madog was imprisoned in the Tower of London, but his sons were taken into royal service and ended up serving in Edward II's bodyguard, which is quite interesting, because Edward II was made Prince of Wales. So he was a Prince of Wales who had princes of Wales in his household. Madog, his sons were allowed to keep their lands on Anglesey. They weren't very important. They were more sort of like gentleman farmers after about 1300. But you can trace them down to about 1360.
So I suppose all that remains to be asked is, what are you working on now, David?
I'm currently working on a book about medieval outlaws. It's centered on Robin Hood, but it's not a conventional. There are a lot of Robin Hood books, and what they tend to do is go, "This is my candidate for who Robin Hood was," and then you get 300 pages of trying to justify that. I argue that the Robin Hood tradition is best understood is if you look at it as like a composite of all kinds of events and individuals from about Magna Carta through to the mid 14th century. I allow for the possibility that there may have been like an individual at the root of it, and I make a very cautious suggestion as to who that might be. But he's buried under all these layers of other men, other events. And if I'm right, if it is with this guy, if you were to meet him, you probably wouldn't think, oh, there's Robin Hood. You'd think, oh, it's just some bloke. The thrust of the argument is that the whole tradition is best understood as like a composite of all kinds of influences. And the legend that comes into being in the late medieval era is basically fiction, but it's got a historical backdrop, it's underpinning. So that's what I'm working on.
Yeah, sounds good.
That's definitely something I want to read. I live half an
Oh,
hour
well,
from
there you go.
Sherwood Forest.
There you go, yes.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, David. That was absolutely fascinating. I think we could talk all day about this. So much of Welsh history is just really interesting and often overlooked.
Once you get into it, it's endlessly fascinating, very, very convoluted.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, David Pillin. And I do recommend everybody gets their hands on David's book, Edward the First and Wales. It's a fascinating read and very insightful. Much. So thanks for joining us, David.
Thank you.
And we might be back to talk about Robin Hood sometime.
Oh, lovely. Yeah.
Definitely. Do join us next time. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for joining us today. And also thank you to those who've subscribed to us either on YouTube or on their favourite podcast provider. That's really great. And again, for feeding back with comments and so on, which is extremely helpful to us. Take care. Thank you.